So I will first start with talking about really what I see in my classroom, which I see history and geography as really a place where we can set up kids for the real world, right? History is so amazing and awesome, and I love it so much. But the main goal of history is to connect it to our present day. And in doing so, we have to connect history to all these other subjects. So before I move on to interconnectedness of all of our disciplines, I first want to start with talking about transitions from homeschooling to hybrid learning. So in our current school, we have quite a few students who made the transition from only homeschooling to this hybrid model. And at the beginning of the school year, not only were these kids who were coming from only homeschooling, but other situations where maybe they were being bullied or ostracized in the traditional schooling model, they were coming in and trying to look for really close friendships and being able to develop their academics and social skills in a more perhaps sympathetic or empathetic environment. And by the end of the first session, maybe even by day 2, all of these kids really had connected. But what we have seen over the course of this year is leaps and bounds in these kids' ability to socialize and really advocate for themselves, which is something that most middle school teachers only dream about. And we have been seeing it just in the last 7 months. So at the very beginning of the year, I did a public speaking project with the kids. They had to present on what their life would be like if they were a person from the Paleolithic era. And this project was to highlight their public speaking ability and let me see where they were when it came to presenting information and the spoken word, which is really important in history. Oral history is one of the greatest methods of passing down history. And one of our kids, Daniil, he was very shy and nervous about doing this. And I had him at a typical level for the first 2 sessions. And in this most recent session, I started realizing that his confidence and his ability to speak and put his knowledge into words was just growing beyond the group that I had placed him in. So just like Tanya and Sean and Joe have all talked about, I was able to move him actually in the middle of a session to a more discussion-based group. And he is now the leader of this group with older students, and he pushes the discussions. He has been able to open his mind and broaden his view of the world, which was also a goal of his and mine when he came in from homeschooling, to really be able to experience what the full world had to offer him rather than just what was at home. So moving on from Daniil, I also had a student, Anya, who at the very beginning of the year was very quiet and reserved. And in this last session, I pushed her to give a full presentation on some research that she had completed. And she was so nervous, but she was so passionate about this information. And she pushed and persevered and was so proud of herself to finally give this presentation. And I think that this again speaks to individualized learning, that if we really focus on what the kids are interested in, they can grow in all different sorts of ways. Okay, so moving on from transitions from homeschooling and other schooling situations to Les Salles and how that's beneficial to many kids. One thing that I think Les Salles is most exceptional at is cross-curricular integration. So I make it a priority of mine to make learning an immersive scenario with humanities and STEM, okay? So just to give a brief outline of how I make sure that this is happening every single day in my classroom, is that Tanya and I actually work tirelessly to make sure that our content is matching up, even if we make little shifts and switches, which actually happen to make the same switches because the kids are interested in the same things in both classes and want to bring those connections in. So this year, just a little bit, we connected myths with ancient civilizations and how myths help pass down the history of these ancient civilizations. We also studied, or the kids studied King Arthur in Tanya's class in tandem with our study of the Middle Ages, which then culminated in our on-site session in France. And finally, in the end of this year, with our older students, we're actually going to be doing a US civics unit with American literature. So that can kind of bring that all into context. Just a few things that I've connected with science that are just bigger, broader things, but almost every day the kids ask me a question that is science-based that comes up in the humanities. And I say, you know, I would really love to answer that question, but that's Joe's job. Go and ask her. So the kids are really bringing these questions from class and feel like they can talk about it between teachers, and that we will talk about it and bring in learning scenarios in which they can develop their understanding of the world in a better way. So at the beginning of the year, Joe and I put together a study of constellations in ancient civilizations and how planetary science and astrology actually really helped the human society grow and develop. And we actually went and did a field trip to a science museum, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then also specifically this year, the development of humans. But in the future, Joe and I have talked about many ways in which we can develop greater cross-curricular integration and very specifically point out what each teacher is teaching and how it's connected to each one of our contents. Also, of course, with our French teacher, Christina, I have specific integration with her. We work together on how I can teach about history or tell her what is on my agenda for history. And so they get a double-sided coin of the history on my side, but then the cultural context today in French class and how those two are connected. And then finally, history of math. I have had so many times the students tell me, well, we learned about this in math because this person was a mathematician. And I'm like, yes, and he was also a scientist. Usually he, although there are many she's as well, but in this current context, he was also a scientist and he was also a philosopher and all of this type of stuff. So we really try to make direct relations. And then in our teachers meeting each week, we talk about this and make sure that we're continuing to integrate these things. So finally, the last two things I'll talk about are the curated field trips that we do when we're in person. Myself and the rest of the teachers work really hard to make sure that the field trips that we are planning are not just, of course, field trips should be fun and a way for the kids to relax, but we also want it to be a place where learning is enriched and solidified. And so like Tanya talked about when we were in France, going and looking at the Gothic architecture, going and seeing what it was like to live in a medieval castle, or what it would have been like to walk down the streets of a medieval town. And like I said, in the first session, we went to a science museum, and not only there were we able to wrap together our studies of myths and constellations and ancient civilizations, but also let the kids go and explore and see what else they wanted to learn about. You know, give us a little sense of what the kids were interested in. And finally, we also do clubs when we're on site. And a lot of these clubs, even if they're not meaning to, do end up pulling from our school content areas. And that is because since we are such a small community and we work together for 12 hours a day, it's hard to separate those things, but I don't really think that that's a bad thing. I think that the kids really see that this school is a learning and growing experience for their life, and not just that school is one thing over here that maybe I don't really like to go to, and home and my other clubs is this other thing. It's really together, and we work really hard to make sure that kids can not only be passionate about what's happening in school, but other extracurricular activities, and show them that those two things can go hand in hand. So I will stop there and pass it on to our wonderful Christina Trailer, our French teacher.